The champagne glass slipped from my hand, shattering against the marble floor of our family estate. Mom's 60th birthday party was in full swing, but all I could hear was the echo of Dad's words. "You're a disgrace to this family, Claire." Senator Gerald Whitmore, my father, stood there in his perfectly tailored suit, his political smile nowhere to be found. The entire room had gone silent. Aunts, uncles, family friends, all staring at me like I was some unwanted stranger who'd crashed their perfect party. "Gerald, that's enough," Mom whispered, but her voice was barely audible over the ringing in my ears. I'd known coming here was a mistake. 3 years of silence between us, and this was how our reunion played out. In front of everyone who mattered to him. Everyone except me. My hands trembled as I bent to pick up the larger pieces of glass. The cut on my finger felt good, real pain to distract from the emotional knife he'd just twisted in my chest. "Claire dropped out of Harvard Law," Dad announced to the room, as if my failures were tonight's entertainment. "Threw away everything we gave her to play activist in some backwater town." I stood slowly, blood dripping from my finger onto my simple black dress. Everyone was watching, waiting for me to break down or fight back. But I'd learned something important in those 3 years away from this toxic family. Sometimes silence speaks louder than screams. That's when Harold Klein stepped forward. Dad's old friend from his early political days, now looking older and more worn than I remembered. His eyes met mine for just a second before he turned to Dad. "Westridge," Harold said quietly, just one word, but the effect was immediate and devastating. Dad's face drained of all color. The confident senator who'd just humiliated his daughter in front of 50 people suddenly looked like he'd seen a ghost. His hand reached for the wall, steadying himself. The champagne glass in his other hand fell, joining mine on the marble floor. "What did you say?" Dad's voice was barely a whisper. Harold's weathered face showed no emotion. "I said Westridge, Gerald. You remember Westridge, don't you?" The room stayed silent, but the energy had completely shifted. Whatever Westridge meant, it had just turned my powerful father into a frightened old man. Mom looked confused, glancing between Dad and Harold. My siblings, perfect Jessica and golden boy Michael, exchanged worried looks. But I knew exactly what Westridge meant. I'd discovered it 3 years ago, buried in sealed legal files during my final semester at Harvard. A real estate development project that had destroyed a small community, a suspicious suicide. A massive land grab that made certain people very rich, and my father's signature was all over it. 3 years earlier, I was supposed to be writing my thesis on constitutional law. Instead, I was spending late nights in the law library basement, digging through old case files that most students ignored. That's when I found the Westridge folder. It should have been routine, just another eminent domain case from the 1990s. But something felt wrong. The timeline didn't make sense. The fair market value payments were suspiciously low. And the activist who'd been fighting the development had supposedly killed himself right before the final court hearing. I spread the documents across the library table, my hands shaking as I recognized the signatures. Planning Commission approvals, environmental impact waivers, final settlement agreements. Gerald Whitmore's name was everywhere. My father hadn't just been involved. He'd orchestrated the entire thing. A sitting state legislator using his influence to push through a development that displaced dozens of families and destroyed protected wetlands. The activist's name was Marcus Webb, age 34. Father of 2. Found dead in his car with a suicide note that looked nothing like his handwriting in other documents. I photographed every page with my phone, uploaded them to a secure cloud account, and walked out of Harvard that night. Not just the library, the entire school. I never looked back. Now, watching Dad's terrified face as Harold mentioned Westridge, I knew my 3 years of investigation had been worth it. After leaving Harvard, I'd moved to rural Virginia and taken a job as a paralegal with a small civil rights law firm. My boss, Elena Martinez, specialized in helping communities fight corrupt developers and politicians. She didn't know about my famous father or my Ivy League background. To her, I was just Claire, a dedicated paralegal who worked harder than anyone else and never asked for credit. But I had a secret mission. Every spare moment, I'd been tracking down the Westridge victims. The families who'd lost their homes, The community members who'd been intimidated into silence. The officials who'd been bought off or threatened. One by one, I'd been building a case that would expose the truth about what happened in Westridge and who was really responsible. I'd found 12 families willing to testify. 3 former city officials, ready to talk. 2 environmental scientists who'd been pressured to falsify reports. And I'd been waiting for the right moment to make my move. Looking at Dad's pale, frightened face, I realized that moment had finally arrived. Gerald caught my eye across the room and gave me the slightest nod. He knew exactly who I was and what I'd been doing. The hunter had become the hunted. The party continued around us, but the mood had completely changed. Dad excused himself, claiming he needed some air. Mom tried to salvage the celebration, but everyone could feel the tension. I slipped out through the back terrace, knowing Dad would head to his study. It was his safe space, the place where he'd conducted his secret business for decades. But I wasn't going to confront him tonight. Not yet. Instead, I walked to my car, pulled out my phone, and called Elena. "Claire, it's late. Is everything okay?" "Elena, remember that case I mentioned? The one I've been researching on my own time. The land development corruption case? What about it?" "I think it's time to move forward. Can you meet me at the office tomorrow morning? I have something big to show you." There was a pause. Elena knew me well enough to know I didn't exaggerate. "How big are we talking?" "Big enough to bring down a sitting U.S. senator." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll be there at 7. And Claire, be careful. People have died over less than this." I ended the call and sat in my car for a moment, looking back at the house where I'd grown up. All those years, I'd thought my father was a hero, a public servant fighting for justice. Now I knew the truth. He was exactly the kind of corrupt politician we'd spent 3 years fighting against. The next morning, I spread 3 years' worth of evidence across Elena's conference table. Bank records showing suspicious payments. Environmental reports with obvious falsifications. Testimony from families who'd been forced from their homes. And at the center of it all, the Westridge development project that had made my father and his associates millions of dollars. Elena studied the documents for 2 hours without saying a word. Finally, she looked up at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Claire, this is incredible work, but do you understand what you're asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to seek justice for the people who were wronged. You're asking me to help you destroy your own father." The words hung in the air between us. She was right, of course. Whatever happened next would tear my family apart permanently. But I thought about Marcus Webb, the activist who'd died trying to protect his community. I thought about the elderly couple who'd lost their family farm. I thought about the dozens of other victims who'd never gotten justice. "He destroyed himself the moment he decided to prioritize money over people's lives," I said quietly. Elena nodded slowly. "Then, let's build the strongest case possible. But we need more than documents. We need witnesses willing to testify publicly. I have them. And we need someone on the inside willing to corroborate the corruption." I smiled for the first time in days. I might have that too. Gerald Klein had been Dad's closest friend for over 20 years. They'd started their political careers together, supporting each other through campaigns and controversies. But something had changed recently. I'd noticed it at family gatherings, the way Gerald looked at Dad with disappointment rather than admiration. I decided to take a risk. I found Gerald's address and drove to his modest apartment across town. When he answered the door, he didn't seem surprised to see me. "I've been wondering when you'd show up," he said, stepping aside to let me in. His apartment was simple, but comfortable. Photos on the walls showed a younger Gerald with his late wife and daughter. No political memorabilia, no pictures with Dad. "You know why I'm here," I said. Gerald poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from me. "Westridge, you were there. You know what really happened." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with regret. "I was young and ambitious. Your father promised me a future in politics if I helped him with certain projects, including Westridge. Especially Westridge." My heart was pounding. This was the breakthrough I'd been hoping for. What really happened to Marcus Webb? Gerald's face crumpled. Marcus wasn't supposed to die. That was never part of the plan. Harold's story came out slowly, painfully. He'd been the inside man feeding Dad information about the community's resistance efforts. The plan was to discredit Marcus, not kill him. But Marcus had been smarter than they'd expected. He'd gathered evidence of the corruption, bank records, recorded conversations, proof of the environmental cover-up. The night before the final hearing, Marcus called me, Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. He said he knew about my involvement, said he'd expose everyone unless the development was stopped. So someone killed him. Your father panicked. He called in favors from people I'd never met. Dangerous people. Harold stood up and walked to a small safe hidden behind a bookshelf. He pulled out a thick manila folder. I kept copies of everything. Insurance, I guess. I never thought I'd actually use them. Inside the folder were photographs, bank records, and recorded conversations. Evidence that proved Marcus Webb had been murdered and that my father had ordered it. Why are you giving this to me now? Harold's weathered face showed every year of guilt he'd been carrying. Because I'm dying, Claire. Cancer. And I can't take this secret with me. He handed me the folder with shaking hands. Your father destroyed a good man and got away with it for 25 years. It's time for that to end. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena and I worked around the clock to verify Harold's evidence and prepare our case. We brought in federal investigators who confirmed the authenticity of the documents. Meanwhile, I continued gathering the Westridge victims. Sarah Chen had lost her family's restaurant. Tom Rodriguez had been forced to sell his auto shop for a fraction of its value. The elderly Morrison couple had been driven from the home they'd lived in for 40 years. Each story was heartbreaking. Each victim deserved justice. But the most important testimony came from Marcus Webb's widow, Linda. I found her living in a small apartment 2 hours outside the city. She'd never remarried, never stopped fighting for her husband's memory. When I showed her Harold's evidence proving her husband had been murdered, she broke down sobbing. I always knew he didn't kill himself, she whispered. Marcus would never leave his children. Never. She agreed to go public with her story, no matter the consequences. If this helps put the people responsible in prison, then it's worth any risk. As our coalition of victims grew stronger, I could feel the momentum building. But I also knew Dad wouldn't go down without a fight. The war was just beginning. Dad made his first move on a Thursday morning. I arrived at work to find Elena meeting with 2 men in expensive suits. FBI agents, she explained after they left. They're opening an official investigation based on our evidence, she said. But they wanted to warn us. Your father's legal team has already filed motions to suppress the evidence, claiming it was obtained illegally. I wasn't surprised. Dad had spent decades learning how to manipulate the system. But what had surprised me was the phone call I received that afternoon. Claire, it's your mother. We need to talk. Mom had never called me at work before. In fact, we'd barely spoken since I'd left Harvard. I can't talk right now, Mom. It's about your father and about what you're doing. My blood went cold. If Dad had involved Mom in his cover-up attempts, things were worse than I'd thought. What about Dad? Meet me at Riverside Park in an hour. Come alone. The line went dead. I told Elena where I was going and drove to the park with my heart racing. Mom was sitting on a bench by the river, looking older and more fragile than I remembered. When she saw me approaching, she stood up and did something completely unexpected. She hugged me. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. Mom's confession changed everything. She'd known about Westridge from the beginning, not the details, but enough to understand that Dad had been involved in something terrible. I was young and scared, she said, tears streaming down her face. Your father was so ambitious, so driven. I thought if I just stayed quiet and supported him, everything would work out. You knew people had been hurt? I suspected. But I told myself it was just politics, just the way things worked. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small key. This opens your father's private safe, the one in his study. There are documents in there, things he kept as insurance against the other people involved. I stared at the key, hardly believing what was happening. Why are you helping me now? Mom looked out at the river, watching a family of ducks swimming peacefully. Because 25 years ago, I chose to protect a lie. And that choice turned me into someone I don't recognize. I won't make that mistake again. She stood up to leave, then turned back to me one last time. Your father will never forgive you for this, or me, but some things are more important than family loyalty. That night, I called Elena and Harold. It was time to end this. We planned the break-in for the following Saturday night. Dad would be at a political fundraiser across town, an event that would keep him busy for hours. Harold knew the house's security system from years of visiting. Elena would wait in her car as our getaway driver, and I would slip into Dad's study and open the safe. It should have been simple. But when I pulled into the driveway at midnight, I saw a light on in Dad's study window. He was home. I called Elena from my car. Abort. He's here. Are you sure? Harold said he'd be at the fundraiser until at least 2 a.m. I was about to drive away when I saw the study light go out. Then Dad appeared at the front door, checking his watch and adjusting his tie. He was leaving late for the fundraiser. I waited until his car disappeared down the street, then slipped around to the back of the house. The spare key was still hidden under the garden gnome where it had been since I was a child. The house felt different now, hostile instead of welcoming. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like thunder. Dad's study was exactly as I remembered it. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, walls covered with photos of him meeting famous politicians. The safe was hidden behind a portrait of our family, back when we'd actually been a family. Mom's key turned easily. Inside were stacks of documents, financial records, and a small digital recorder. But what caught my attention was a handwritten note clipped to the front of one folder. Marcus Webb, final solution. The documents in Dad's safe were even more damning than I'd hoped. Detailed plans for silencing Marcus Webb. Bank records showing payments to the men who'd killed him, and recordings of phone conversations between Dad and his co-conspirators. But the most shocking discovery was a list of other activists and community leaders who'd been dealt with over the years. My father wasn't just corrupt. He was a serial killer who used his political connections to eliminate anyone who threatened his interests. I photographed everything with my phone, uploaded the files to my secure cloud account, and carefully returned the documents to the safe. As I was preparing to leave, I heard a car door slam outside. Dad was back early. I quickly closed the safe and repositioned the family portrait, but I could hear his footsteps on the front porch. There was no way to get out of the study without being seen. I hid behind the heavy curtains just as the study door opened. Dad walked directly to his desk and picked up the phone. "We have a problem," he said. "Harold's been talking to people, and I think Claire's involved." My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I don't care what it costs. Find out everything she knows and who she's been talking to, and then make sure this problem goes away permanently." He was ordering my death. My own father was planning to have me killed. I stayed hidden until Dad left the study, then slipped out of the house as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start my car. I drove straight to Elena's apartment and pounded on her door until she answered. "Claire, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "We need to accelerate our timeline. Dad knows we're investigating him, and he's planning to kill me." Elena's face went white. "Are you serious?" I showed her the photos I'd taken of the safe documents, including the conversation I'd recorded on my phone. "We need to go public immediately, before he has a chance to silence any more witnesses." Elena called Harold, and the three of us spent the rest of the night preparing for a press conference. We contacted every major news outlet, uploaded our evidence to multiple secure servers, and prepared testimony from all the Westridge victims. By sunrise, we were ready. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked as we reviewed our final preparations. "Once we go public, there's no turning back." I thought about Marcus Webb and all the other victims who'd been silenced. I thought about Mom's courage in finally standing up for what was right. I thought about Harold's determination to make amends before he died. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. At 10 a.m. sharp, we held our press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. I sat at a long table with Elena, Harold, and Linda Webb. Behind us were enlarged photographs of Marcus Webb and the other victims. Elena spoke first, outlining the evidence we'd gathered and the scope of the corruption we'd uncovered. Then Harold stepped to the microphone with his folder of evidence. 25 years ago, I helped Senator Gerald Whitmore orchestrate one of the most callous land grabs in Virginia history. We displaced dozens of families, destroyed protected wetlands, and murdered a good man who tried to stop us. The room erupted in shouting questions, but Harold continued steadily. I kept evidence of our crimes because I was afraid Gerald would eventually silence me too. Today, I'm releasing that evidence because the truth matters more than my safety. Linda Webb spoke next, her voice breaking as she described her husband's final days and her decades-long fight for justice. Finally, it was my turn. I looked directly into the cameras and spoke the words I'd been rehearsing for 3 years. My name is Claire Whitmore. Senator Gerald Whitmore is my father, and based on evidence I've gathered over the past 3 years, I believe he should be arrested for murder, corruption, and conspiracy. The room exploded in chaos. The story dominated every news cycle for the next week. Dad's face was on every channel, every newspaper front page, every social media feed. His initial response was predictable. Deny everything, claim the evidence was fabricated, attack my credibility by calling me an unstable daughter seeking attention. But the evidence was too strong and too well documented. Federal investigators raided his Senate office and our family home. They seized computers, financial records, and the contents of his private safe. Within 48 hours, 3 other politicians connected to the Westridge project had resigned from office. Dad's legal team worked frantically to control the damage, but new evidence kept emerging. Other activists who died under suspicious circumstances. Other communities that had been destroyed by similar land grabs. The conspiracy was much larger than even I had imagined. Meanwhile, I was living under police protection. Dad's threats against my life had been taken seriously by federal investigators, but I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Mom called me every day, checking on my safety and expressing her pride in my courage. Jessica and Michael, however, refused to speak to me. They'd chosen to stand by Dad, believing his version of events. I was sad about losing my siblings, but not surprised. They'd always been more interested in the family's wealth and status than in doing what was right. 2 weeks after our press conference, the federal grand jury returned its indictment. Gerald Whitmore was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, mail fraud, and violation of civil rights. The other defendants included 2 former mayors, a county prosecutor, and the CEO of the development company that had built on the stolen Westridge land. Dad's arrest was broadcast live on every major network. I watched from Elena's office as federal agents led him out of the Senate building in handcuffs. He looked old and defeated, nothing like the powerful man who'd terrorized me at Mom's birthday party. Harold called me that afternoon with an update on his health. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months left, but I'll live long enough to testify at the trial. Are you ready for what that will mean? The media attention, the cross-examination? Harold's voice was steady and determined. I've been ready for 25 years. It's time to pay for what we did. Linda Webb was also prepared to testify, along with a dozen other Westridge victims. The prosecution's case was ironclad. But I knew Dad wouldn't give up easily. He still had allies, still had money, still had political connections. The real fight was just beginning. The trial began 6 months later. I testified on the second day, walking the jury through my investigation and the evidence I'd uncovered. Dad's defense attorney tried to paint me as a vengeful daughter trying to destroy her father's career, but the physical evidence spoke for itself. Harold's testimony was devastating. He spent 2 full days describing the conspiracy in detail, playing recorded conversations and identifying bank records. By the time Linda Webb took the stand to describe her husband's final days, several jurors were openly crying. Dad sat at the defense table looking defiant, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew the evidence was overwhelming. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution played the recording I'd made of Dad ordering my death. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Dad was sent to prison. As the judge read the sentence, I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. Justice for Marcus Webb and all the other victims had finally been served. After the trial, I faced a choice about my future. Publishers wanted me to write a book about the case. Television producers offered me my own show. Law firms tried to recruit me with massive salary offers. I turned them all down. Instead, I used the settlement money from a civil lawsuit against Dad and his co-conspirators to start a nonprofit organization. The Marcus Webb Foundation provides legal assistance to communities fighting corrupt developers and politicians. We've already helped stop 3 illegal land grabs and exposed 2 more murder cases connected to environmental activism. Elena left her small firm to become the foundation's general counsel. Harold, in his final months, served as our first board chairman. Mom moved out of the family estate and bought a small house near my apartment. We have dinner together every Sunday and are slowly rebuilding our relationship. Jessica and Michael still refuse to speak to me, but I hope that will change someday. 5 years have passed since that birthday party confrontation that started everything. I'm 32 now, and I've found a sense of purpose I never knew was possible. Last month, we opened the Marcus Webb Community Center in the heart of what used to be Westridge. It provides job training, legal services, and environmental education to the families who were displaced decades ago. Linda Webb cut the ribbon at our opening ceremony. Marcus would be so proud, she told me, tears in her eyes. He always believed that truth and justice would prevail eventually. Looking around at the community we'd helped rebuild, I knew he was right. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Sometimes the most important fight is the one that costs you everything you thought you wanted. And sometimes the greatest victory is knowing that you stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Dad won't be in prison for long, but his victims finally have their voices back. That's the kind of legacy worth fighting for. The reporter's question caught me off guard during last week's press conference about our latest case. Miss Whitmore, looking back, do you ever regret exposing your father? Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd stayed silent? I thought about the question for a long moment before answering. Every day, I think about the communities we've helped save from corruption. I think about the activists who are still alive because we exposed a network of killers. I think about the families who got justice after decades of being ignored. I paused, looking out at the crowd of reporters and community members. My father made his choices 25 years ago when he decided that money and power were more important than human lives. I made my choice 3 years ago when I decided that truth was more important than family loyalty. And you don't regret that choice? The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to find the courage to act. After the press conference, I drove to the cemetery where Marcus Webb is buried. I visit his grave every year on the anniversary of his death, updating him on our progress and promising to keep fighting. This year I had especially good news to share. We got them, Marcus, I said, placing fresh flowers on his headstone. All of them. The last of Dad's co-conspirators had been convicted the week before. After 5 years of investigations and trials, every person involved in the Westridge conspiracy was either dead or in prison. Your children are doing well, I continued. Your son just graduated from college with a degree in environmental law. He wants to join our foundation. I sat down on the grass next to his grave, feeling the peace that comes from completed justice. I know you probably never imagined that the daughter of one of your killers would be the one to bring them down. But I hope you understand why I had to do it. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment I could almost feel his presence. Thank you for being brave enough to stand up to them, even when you knew it might cost you everything. Your courage inspired mine. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how much my life had changed since that terrible birthday party 5 years ago. I'd lost the family I thought I wanted, but I'd found the purpose I never knew I needed. Today marks the 6th anniversary of Dad's sentencing. I'm sitting in my office at the Marcus Webb Foundation, reviewing applications for our newest program, a scholarship fund for children whose parents were killed for environmental activism. The irony isn't lost on me, the daughter of a killer helping the children of his victims. But sometimes life's greatest gifts come from its most painful experiences. My phone buzzes with a text from Mom. Saw your interview on the news last night. So proud of you. Another text from Elena. New case just came in. Corrupt mining company in West Virginia. Interested? And finally, a message from an unknown number. My father was murdered by developers in 1998. Can you help me find justice? I smile and start typing my response. The work continues. The fight for justice never really ends. It just passes from one generation to the next. But as long as there are people willing to speak truth to power, as long as there are voices willing to stand up for the voiceless, there's always hope. Dad thought he could silence the truth by killing Marcus Webb. Instead, he just ensured that the truth would eventually destroy him. That's the thing about justice. It may be delayed, but it's never truly defeated, and sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places, even from the daughter of the man who tried to bury it forever.